Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we embark on a journey into the primordial mists, pulling back the veil of time to explore the genesis of the Greek myths. As we settle in, do let me know where in the world you are tuning in from. It is a pleasure to have you here in this space of storytelling. Get cozy, disconnect from the bustle of your day, and let us begin at the very root of all things. Before the towering peaks of Olympus, before the solid earth, the restless seas, or the vast arched sky, there was only chaos. Do not mistake this for the common, modern understanding of a messy room or a crowded street. This was something far more profound, an ancient, formless void, an abyssal silence that existed long before the architecture of language could ever hope to describe it. It was a gaping, infinite nothingness, lacking direction, boundary, or light. It was neither moral nor immoral, neither kind nor cruel. Simply was. From this absolute vacuum, the first tremors of existence began to ripple. Good evening and welcome back to the hearth. Tonight we are turning back the clock, not just by centuries, but by aeons, to venture into the primordial depths of Greek mythology. As we settle in, do let me know where in the world you are tuning in from tonight. Find a comfortable spot, let the weight of the day fall away, and let us begin. In the beginning, there was no solid earth to stand upon, no shimmering expanse of sea, and no vast, vaulted sky. There was only chaos. But do not mistake this for the petty, modern definition of the word, that frantic state of disorder or mere confusion. This was something far more ancient, a state of being older than language itself. Chaos was a yawning, abyssal void, a gaping nothingness that lacked both form and direction. It was not malicious, nor was it kind. It simply was. From that ancient, hollow silence came the first stirrings of existence. Out of the void emerged Gaia, the earth, vast, unshaking, and fertile. Following her was Tartarus, the deep, dread-filled abyss beneath the world, a place of shadows that would later hold the darkest secrets of creation. And then came Eros, the pulse of love and desire. He was not a winged boy with a bow, as the later poets would envision him, but the fundamental binding agent of all future creation, the magnetic force that pulled disparate parts into a whole. These were not yet gods in the sense of temples and sacrifices. They were the elemental truths of the universe given shape. Then appeared Nyx, the night, cloaked in a velvet shadow so absolute that even chaos itself recoiled. At her side walked Erebus, the darkness of the underworld, destined to dwell in that early, hallowed silence. From the union of this dark pair, the light began to take its first breaths. Ether, the pure, luminous upper air breathed by the immortals, and Hemera, the day, who was fated from the dawn of time to endlessly chase her mother across the firmament. Thus, the cycle of day and night was born, not through the cold laws of science, but through the myth of a strange, invisible family of titans who painted the sky with light and shadow, hour by fleeting hour. Gaia, the earth herself, did not remain stagnant. She was patient, fertile, and teeming with potential. From her own essence, she birthed Uranus, the sky. He was vast, star-strewn, and infinite. He was both her son and, as the cycle of creation demanded, her consort. When he arched over her, stretching his celestial canopy across the heavens, the world found its first true shape, a domed sky resting upon a broad, endless plain. Gaia continued her work, bringing forth the mountains, tall and wild, and Pontus, the surging, temperamental sea. He possessed a will of his own, churning with power long before the first ship dared to sail his waters or the first sea monster rose from the depths. Together, earth and sky became the first great power couple, and their union brought forth the Titans. These were the first generation of colossal beings who would rule the cosmos long before Zeus and his siblings ever dreamed of power. There were 12 in all, 6 sons and 6 daughters, each a manifestation of nature's raw magnitude. There was Oceanus, the river that encircled the entire world, Hyperion, the radiant lord of light, Zeus, the seeker of truth, Crius, the bearer of constellations, Iapetus, the ancestor of mankind, and Cronus, the youngest, the most cunning of them all. Among the daughters, there was Thea, the shimmering mother of the sun and moon, Rhea, the future mother of the gods, Themis, the embodiment of divine law, Mnemosyne, the personification of memory, Phoebe, the radiant, and Tethys, the nourishing, life-giving sea. But Gaia's womb was not finished. It held more than just the majestic. It contained the monstrous, the beings of immense strength and terrifying dread. First came the Cyclopes, Brontes, Steripes, and Argesh. Each possessed a single, burning eye set into their brow, bright as a forge in the dead of night. They were the master smiths, capable of hammering lightning into existence, and they feared no deity or beast. Then came the Centimanes, the hundred-handed ones. These were enormous, terrifying figures, each boasting 50 heads and 100 arms. When angered, they were capable of shaking the very foundations of the world. Uranus, though lord of the sky, looked upon these monstrous offspring with a mixture of shame and cowardice. He feared their grotesque power, viewing them as a threat to his absolute dominion. In a cruel act of betrayal, he forced them back into Gaia's womb, the deepest, darkest recesses of the earth, and sealed them there, hidden away beneath layers of rock and crushing grief. Gaia groaned under their weight. The earth, once proud and nurturing, now withered with every pained breath. It was in this stifling, subterranean agony that she began to scheme. But that is a story for another day. For now, remember this. In the dawn of the ages, before laws, before justice, and before the plow or the sword, the world was forged through force, union, and profound grief. Chaos birthed the initial forms, but Gaia, the Great Mother, gave them the ground upon which they stood. The Olympian court did not mirror the rigid, stone-walled hierarchy of mortal kingdoms. There were no cobblestone roads leading to its gates, no heralds with golden trumpets announcing the arrival of dignitaries, and certainly no phalanxes of armored infantry standing watch at its foundations. The gods required no fortifications. They were the fortifications. The very air of Olympus served as their threshold, an ethereal, shimmering veil that burned the lungs of any mortal who dared to ascend too high. It was a realm untouched by the biting frost of winter, the ravages of storm, or the cruel decay of time. Here, the atmosphere hummed with the resonance of a world perpetually beginning. The halls were constructed of polished marble that seemed to exhale light, and ceilings were vaulted with the captured brilliance of 1,000 starfields. Corridors stretched out, vast and yawning, wide enough for the restless winds to wander through and gossip with the shadows. In this high sanctuary, the gods did not appear as fickle omens or whispering phantoms. They manifested in their full, terrifying glory, radiant, visceral, and vibrating with a vitality that made the most vigorous mortal seem like a fading sketch on vellum. At the summit of this celestial peak sat Zeus, the king of gods and men, anchored to a throne forged from the raw, jagged essence of thunder. He did not rule solely through the brutal kineticism of his power, though that power remained unmatched in any realm. He ruled by the grim architecture of fate and the long, heavy memory of the Titanomachy. When he spoke, his voice rolled across the firmament like a thunderstorm gathering in the distance. When he looked upon the world, his gaze pierced through the shroud of clouds and the limitations of time itself. In his grip, he held the master bolt, a cyclopean masterpiece, the ultimate instrument of judgment, designed to end debates with a flash of searing light. Yet Zeus was no absolute monarch. Beside him sat Hera, his queen, who ruled not as a consort, but as a sovereign force in her own right. She was the goddess of the matrimonial bond, the architect of queenship, and the embodiment of the silent, simmering fury that follows a woman betrayed. Proud, unyielding, and meticulous in her grievances, Hera kept a ledger of every slight, a trait that would one day weave the threads of tragedy for gods and mortals alike. Her crown was not bestowed. It was forged in the heat of a cosmic betrayal and tempered by the sanctity of oaths that even Zeus dared not break. Dido, or Demeter, as the whispers of the earth would later name her, followed, the goddess of the golden harvest and the blooming earth. Where her bare feet pressed into the soil, the ground softened as if welcoming a lover, and dormant seeds would stir from their slumber. She was the pulse of the seasons, the promise of bounty. Without her, the world turned to brittle, barren dust. Though she belonged to the divine court, she was a traveler at heart, wandering the world below to watch over the weary plowmen and the mothers who prayed to her at the first light of dawn. Older than most, she possessed a quiet, oceanic depth that silenced the vanity of her peers. Then there was Hestia, the firstborn, the eldest child of Crones and Rhea. She was the last to be liberated from her father's suffocating belly, yet she harbored no bitterness. She asked for no temples to be raised in her name, demanded no grand epic poems, and sought no lovers. She was the keeper of the eternal flame, the silent guardian of the hearth fire that flickered in every home across the earth. Her power was the most subtle of all, a warm, persistent light that defined the boundary between the wild dark and the safety of the hearth. Hestia lived there, anchored to the center of the world. The younger generation soon arrived, emerging in ways as strange as their natures. Athena was the first of these, born not from the womb, but from the searing logic of the divine mind. When Zeus devoured the titaness Metis, fearing her offspring would inevitably surpass him, he believed he had neutralized the threat. But Metis did not fade. Within the dark, echoing corridors of his consciousness, she remained, whispering, scheming, and distilling the essence of pure wisdom. One day, the pressure within Zeus became unbearable. With a cry that shook the foundations of Olympus, the king of gods split his own skull. Athena sprang forth in a blinding flash, fully grown and armored in bronze, her hand already gripping a spear. Her eyes were sharp as flint, cutting through deception. For she was the goddess of wisdom, strategic warfare, and the hard, cold necessity of justice. She possessed no patience for the frivolities of the younger gods. Apollo and Artemis, the celestial twins, followed soon after. They were the children of Leto, a titaness who had been driven to the edge of madness and exhaustion, wandering the world in search of a sanctuary where she might safely deliver her brood. Every land, fearing the wrath of Hera, turned her away, until the floating, unstable island of Delos finally offered her refuge. Apollo, golden-haired and radiant, took for himself the domains of light, prophecy, music, and the delicate art of healing. Artemis, his counterpart, became the swift and silver, a goddess who moved through the shadows of the woods as the mistress of the hunt, the moon, and all things untamed. Together, they marked the arrival of a new, restless generation of gods, radiant, intimate, and inextricably tied to the fates of the mortals below. Ares, the god of slaughter, was also born of the divine union, though he found himself unloved by both Zeus and Hera. He represented strength stripped of discipline, a chaotic, unreasoning rage. While his name was spoken in hushed tones of terror, he was rarely honored, foreshadowed his every step, and though he gloried in the carnage, he was frequently outmaneuvered by the cunning of his sister, Athena, and the ingenuity of others. His polar opposite was Hephaestus, the smith god. Whether he was cast from Olympus in a fit of rage by Zeus or born solely of Hera's pride, the legends differ, but his fate remained the same. He found his solace in the heat of the forge. Limping, twisted, yet possessed of a genius that put the gods to shame, he crafted palaces, armor, and golden automatons. He was the indispensable architect of their grandeur. Then came Aphrodite, who drifted into existence not through birth, but by way of the sea's foam, the byproduct of Uranus's severed flesh cast into the swirling surf of Cyprus. She emerged from the waves, a vision of beauty so potent it was inherently dangerous. Wherever she walked, love, lust, jealousy, and ruin bloomed in her wake. Even Zeus, the king of the cosmos, found himself unable to fully command her. She bound gods and mortals alike with a single, devastating glance. Hermes, the trickster and herald, was the last of this initial court. Born of Zeus and the nymph Maia, he was a creature of movement and mercury. He possessed winged sandals and a grin that suggested he knew a joke at everyone else's expense. On the very day of his birth, he stole Apollo's cattle, singing a song so beguiling that he became indispensable to the gods before he had even learned to walk. As the messenger, the guide of souls, and the patron of thieves, he was the force that ensured borders remained porous and secrets always traveled. This was the Olympian order, not a gathering of saints, but an assembly of raw elemental powers. They were deeply flawed, vibrant, and vast. They quarreled like siblings, took sides in the petty squabbles of men, fell into destructive loves, and enacted a justice that was often as cruel as it was necessary. Above all, they watched the earth below and molded it to their whims. The age of the Titans had been violently extinguished, and in its place arose an era defined by the stories of gods walking among men, of heroes born from celestial unions, and of a world forever altered by the reach of the divine. Yet, even as they sat upon their marble thrones, the gods understood that peace was a fragile equilibrium. Fate had not yet whispered its final word. Long before man learned to raise cities of polished stone or carve his desperate prayers into rock, the earth was silent. The gods ruled a green, untamed wilderness teeming with beasts and shadows, but it lacked a voice to sing to the stars and a fire to ward off the encroaching night. It was Prometheus, a titan of the old blood, who looked upon the empty, wild world and imagined the form of man. He was no ally to cronies, nor had he been cast into the abyss of Tartarus. During the Great War, he had stood with Zeus, not out of a spirit of loyalty, but through the burden of foresight. He possessed the gift of prophecy. He knew which way the storm would break, and he chose the side that held the future. His name, Prometheus, meant forethought, and it was a title he earned every day. He was the brother to Epimetheus, whose name signified afterthought, a pair as mismatched as fire and water. Where Epimetheus acted in haste and lamented in leisure, Prometheus looked to the horizon, calculated the consequences, and questioned the moral legitimacy of every decree issued from Olympus. He walked the knife edge between the fading world of the Titans and the vibrant, dangerous reign of the Olympians, a creature of reason in a cosmos governed by the whims of passion. It was he who finally sculpted mankind. Some say he gathered the clay beside a riverbank, using his own breath to infuse the mud with the spark of life. Others claim he molded them to mirror the image of the gods, upright, thoughtful, and brimming with potential. But regardless of the method, the result was a creature that was tragically incomplete. Soft-skinned, slow of foot, clawless, and utterly defenseless against the harsh realities of the wild. They huddled naked under the indifferent sky, trembling as the winter descended, defenseless against the fangs of the beasts. Prometheus watched them with a growing, heavy pity. He ascended the heights of Olympus and begged Zeus to grant man a gift, something to bridge the gap between animal instinct and divine intellect. Zeus refused. He saw in these fragile creatures not a promise, but a future peril. And with the fire, they acquired the dangerous, intoxicating scent of defiance. Zeus discovered the theft with a fury that nearly shattered the firmament. To punish man, he orchestrated a trap, commissioning the gods to craft a gift that was a curse woven into gold. Hephaestus sculpted her from clay, a woman of impossible beauty. Aphrodite graced her with charm, Hermes gifted her with cunning, and Athena cloaked her in silver. They called her Pandora, the all-gifted. She was presented to Epimetheus with a sealed jar, an object that would later be misremembered as a box, containing the darkest maladies of the universe: disease, toil, madness, envy, and the creeping shadow of death itself. Epimetheus, the eternal fool, ignored the warnings of his brother and took her in. When Pandora, driven by the insatiable curiosity that the gods had planted within her, finally broke the seal, the evils of existence spilled out into the world like smoke escaping a chamber too long confined. Mankind, who had known a brief, golden youth of peace, found themselves hunted by fate. Hunger gnawed at their bellies. War stained the earth with blood. Age stooped their once straight backs. Only hope remained in the bottom of the jar, a flickering, fragile light that some say was an accident, and others say was the gods' final, cruel joke to keep them longing for a peace that would never return. As for Prometheus, his punishment was absolute. For the crime of defying Olympus, Zeus had him chained to a mountain at the edge of the world. Some claim it was the Caucasus, others say a place lost to the map of history. He was bound in adamantine chains that neither time nor strength could break. Every day, an eagle, a creature born of the monster Typhon or sent by Zeus himself, would descend to feast upon his liver. Every night, the wound would knit itself back together, and every morning, the agony would begin anew. He was immortal, and so his suffering was infinite. He endured it for generations, watching as kingdoms rose and fell, watching as men grew to forget the very God who had fashioned them from mud and courage. And yet, even in the depths of his torment, Prometheus did not repent. He possessed a secret, a truth that Zeus feared more than any war. He knew that one day, the king of the gods would fall, not by the edge of a blade or the might of a rebellion, but by his own seed. This knowledge was his shield. Zeus could not destroy him without first uncovering the name of the woman who would bear his doom. So the Titan waited, bound but unbowed, while men lit their fires in the dark and whispered the name of the one who had dared to steal the light from the gods. But prophecy, once whispered by the lips of the gods or carved into the cold stone of the oracle, is a vine that binds its victims regardless of their struggle. Perseus returned to Argos, his brow heavy with the crown of his triumphs. Yet the ghost of his grandfather, King Acrisius, remained tethered to the shadows of the palace. Haunted by the Delphic decree that he would meet his end at the hands of his own blood, Acrisius had abandoned his throne to wander in exile, a king without a kingdom, seeking refuge in the anonymity of the common folk. Destiny, however, is a patient hunter. At the funeral games of a neighboring monarch, the air was thick with the scent of dust and sweat. Perseus, his arm coiled with the strength of a demigod, hurled a discus that defied the wind. It flew wide, a trajectory written in the stars, and struck an old man amidst the spectators. When the dust settled, Perseus discovered he had felled none other than Acrisius. The prophecy had clawed its way to fruition not through the blade of a conqueror, but through the cruel, blind happenstance of a game. Thus, the circle of the myth tightened its grip. The king died unaware that his transition into the afterlife was not a murder, but the fulfillment of an ancient, unavoidable debt to fate. Perseus had slain the Gorgon, saved the ethereal Andromeda, and laid the foundations for a dynasty of kings. Yet he bore the weight of his grandfather's spirit like a second, invisible cloak. He knew that his own life was merely a prelude, for within his veins burned the lineage that would eventually birth the greatest of them all, Heracles. If Perseus was the morning star of heroism, Heracles was the burning meridian, a force of nature that rattled the very rafters of Olympus. His name was whispered across every shoreline kissed by the Mediterranean breeze, a sound that carried the gravity of a thunderclap echoing over jagged peaks. He was the embodiment of human paradox, a man too vast for the world, straddling the razor-thin border between the agony of mortality and the cold, unyielding divinity of his father Zeus. Heracles was the great-grandson of Perseus, a scion of Argos and a vessel for the king of the gods. Yet, The same divine spark that granted him the strength to uproot mountains condemned him to a life of perpetual turbulence. The gods, in their caprice, bestowed upon him the might to topple empires but shackled his soul to the heavy, rusted chains of suffering. His very inception was an affront to the natural order. Zeus, insatiable in his desires, cast his gaze upon Alcmene, the virtuous wife of the Theban general Amphitryon. Cloaking himself in the general's likeness, the thunderer descended, stretching a single night into three, a divine manipulation of time that ensured the seed of the gods took deep, permanent root within her. From that union sprang the hero, accompanied by his half-brother, Iphicles, a mortal child born of the rightful husband. High above, Hera watched from her golden throne, her eyes cold as tempered steel. She saw not a child, but a living testament to her husband's infidelity, a threat to the celestial hierarchy she had fought so fiercely to maintain. Even in his swaddling clothes, the infant displayed the mark of the divine. Hera, consumed by a jealous, simmering wrath, slipped two serpents into the nursery, their scales glistening like oil in the moonlight. They slithered toward the cradle, fangs dripping with venom, intent on extinguishing the spark of life before it could ignite. But the infant did not cry. With hands as thick and firm as polished oak, he seized the serpents, throttling the life from them before a single nurse could draw breath to scream. That night the legends began to breathe. As he matured into a youth, he mastered the arts of the aristocracy, archery, the chariot, and the delicate dance of the lyre. Yet, beneath the veneer of the nobleman, there existed a primal, restless hum in his blood. No tutor could quell the wildness that flickered in his eyes. Manhood brought him the fragile warmth of love and the crushing weight of ruin. He wed Megara, daughter of the Theban king Creon, finding a rare, quiet peace in the rhythm of domestic life. But Hera's memory was as long as the horizon. In a fit of divine malice, she descended upon his psyche, shrouding his mind in a thick, suffocating veil of insanity. He moved through his halls like a wraith, his vision distorted by the blood-red fog of madness. When the clouds finally parted and his sanity returned, he stood amidst the ruins of his house, his hands stained with the blood of his beloved wife and children. He screamed to the heavens, his voice a jagged prayer, but Olympus offered only the deafening silence of the indifferent. Driven by a grief that hollowed out his soul, he sought the oracle at Delphi. The Pythia, her eyes clouded with the fumes of the earth, spoke in riddles. He must bow before Eurystheus, the king of Tyrans, a man of lesser strength but higher station, whom fate had conspired to place in command. Only through the crucible of labor, through the ritualized agony of servitude, could he hope to burn away the stain of his tragedy. Thus began the 12 labors, a series of trials so cataclysmic they forced even the Olympians to pause and watch. First was the Nemean lion, a beast whose golden hide repelled the sharpest bronze and iron. Heracles cornered the monster within its cave, and with no weapon but his own grip, he strangled the life from it. He flayed the beast with its own razor-sharp claw, draping the impenetrable pelt over his shoulders, a mantle of armor that would serve as his armor against the world. Then came the Lernaean Hydra, a multi-headed terror of the swamps. For every neck severed, 2 more sprouted in a tangled, serpentine fury. Guided by his nephew Iolaus, who cauterized the stumps with flame, Heracles finally felled the immortal head, burying it beneath a mountain of rock. He dipped his arrows into its toxic blood, creating weapons that could fell even the denizens of Olympus. He captured the Ceryneian hind, its hooves of bronze and antlers of gold, sacred to the virgin huntress Artemis. For a year, he tracked it across the wild, treating the creature with a reverence that eventually earned him the goddess's begrudging respect. He mastered the Erymanthian boar in the snow-dusted heights of Arcadia, binding the creature and lugging it back to the terrified Eurystheus, who had taken refuge in a bronze jar, trembling as the hero laughed beneath the crushing weight of the beast. He cleansed the Augean stables, an Augean task of filth, by diverting the flow of entire rivers, washing away decades of neglect in a single roaring afternoon. He drove away the Stymphalian birds, their bronze feathers falling like javelins, by sounding the shrill rattles gifted to him by Athena, forcing them into the sky where he picked them off with his poisoned shafts. He mastered the Cretan bull, a creature possessed by the sea salt madness of Poseidon, wrestled it to the earth, and hauled it across the waves. He traveled to Thrace to tame the man-eating mares of Diomedes, feeding their master to the beasts until they grew as docile as lambs. The ninth labor, the quest for the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons, ended in a tragic misunderstanding fueled by Hera's whispers. The queen had meant to yield the prize, but the ensuing skirmish left her dead. He pushed to the edge of the world to steal the cattle of Geryon, a triple-bodied titan, erecting the great pillars of Gibraltar as a testament to his passage. Yet Eurystheus, ever the coward, dismissed these successes, claiming help from others as an invalidation of the deed. He demanded two more. The 11th led him to the Hesperides, where he tricked the sky-bearer, Atlas, into holding the weight of the heavens while he plucked the golden apples from the dragon-guarded tree. Finally, the 12th and most harrowing, the descent into Hades itself. Without armor or armies, he presented himself before the Lord of the Dead, earning permission to lead the three-headed hound, Cerberus, into the light of the sun. The beast snarled and drooled, a creature of the void brought face to face with the man who had defied all boundaries. With the return of the hound, his redemption was earned. But for Heracles, there would never be the quiet rest of a common man. His life remained a sequence of battles and tragic entanglements, until the final act, a poisoned tunic, sent by his wife Deianira, who had been deceived by the venomous blood of the centaur Neshes. As the poison ignited his flesh like liquid fire, Heracles climbed Mount Ida and built his own pyre. He would not be consumed by death, but by the flame of his own making. As his mortal remains turned to ash, the sky opened. Zeus descended, and the hero was pulled into the stars, granted the gift of immortality and the hand of Hebe, the goddess of youth. He had walked among men as a sufferer, but he ascended to Olympus as a god, his name forever the shorthand for greatness in the face of impossible sorrow. Generations bled into one another, and the house of Cadmus seemed perpetually shadowed by the wings of inexorable doom. His daughters, once princesses of a golden dawn, found their lives dismantled by the cruelty of the gods. Ino, driven to the precipice of sanity, cast her own son into the churning abyss of the sea. Autono's son, Actaeon, the skilled hunter, met a fate far more visceral. He stumbled upon Artemis bathing in a secret grotto, and for that singular, forbidden glimpse, he was transformed into a stag and torn asunder by his own hounds. Then came Semele, the cherished mortal mistress of Zeus, whose vanity and tragedy were etched by Hera's malice. Tricked into demanding that the king of gods reveal his true, celestial form, she was consumed instantly by the searing, unadulterated radiance of his divinity, leaving behind only the ash of her humanity and the embers of a divine secret. Agave, lost in a fever dream of Dionysian frenzy, descended into a blood-soaked madness so profound that she looked upon her own son, Pentheus, and saw not the flesh of her flesh, but the predatory silhouette of a lion. With a primal, unthinking hunger, she dismantled him limb from limb, only to wake from her trance to the horrific reality of her own hands stained in his ruin. Yet, it was through Cadmus's great-grandson, Laius, that the tapestry of ruin reached its most intricate and agonizing knot. Laius had ascended to the throne of Thebes and claimed the noble Jocasta as his queen. But the gods, ever jealous of mortal prosperity, had never truly forgiven the house of Cadmus. A chilling prophecy descended from the oracle like a death sentence. Any son born to them would be the architect of his father's slaughter and the defiler of his mother's bed. As is the tragic rhythm of all Greek lore, The warning served not as a shield, but as the very catalyst for the catastrophe. Laius and Jocasta defied the heavens. A son was born, and with him, the curse began to coil around their throats. Paralyzed by the specter of the prophecy, Laius commanded that the infant's ankles be pierced and bound with bronze pins, consigning the babe to a servant with orders to be abandoned on the jagged, wind-swept slopes of Mount Cithaeron. But the servant, moved by an unbidden tide of pity, spared the child, handing him to a passing shepherd. This infant would eventually find sanctuary in the court of Corinth, welcomed by King Polybus and Queen Merope. They named him Oedipus, swollen foot, and raised him as their own, shrouding his origins in silence. Oedipus blossomed into a man of sharp intellect and haughty spirit, yet whispers of his true parentage nagged at his conscience like a festering wound. Seeking clarity, he journeyed to Delphi, where the Pythia delivered a verdict that chilled his very marrow. He was destined to slay his father and lie with his mother. Terrified, and still believing Polybus and Merope to be his biological kin, Oedipus fled Corinth to protect them, never realizing that every stride he took was a step deeper into the web of his own destruction. On a dusty, sun-drenched crossroads near Daulis, he encountered an imperious old man traveling with a retinue of guards. A petty dispute over the right-of-way ignited a volatile rage in Oedipus. In the ensuing violence, he struck down the old man and his attendants. He did not know then that he had spilled the blood of his progenitor, King Laius of Thebes. He pressed on toward a city under siege, not by a human army, but by the Sphinx, a monstrous hybrid of lion, eagle, and woman. She held the city in a stranglehold, devouring all who failed to solve her enigma. Her riddle was a mockery of life itself. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 in the evening? Oedipus, guided by a brilliance that was both his gift and his curse, answered without hesitation. Man, who crawls as an infant, walks erect in his prime, and leans upon a staff in the twilight of his years. Defeated, the Sphinx cast herself into the abyss. Thebes erupted in ecstasy, crowning their savior king and gifting him the hand of the widowed queen, Jocasta. Unwittingly, the prophecy had fulfilled itself in the shadows of their ignorance. Years drifted by. Oedipus ruled with wisdom, fathering 4 children, Eteocles, Polynices, Antigone, and Ismene. But the gods do not suffer the truth to remain buried. A suffocating plague descended upon Thebes, and the oracle declared the land tainted by an unpunished murder. As the investigation deepened, the threads of the past began to unravel with agonizing precision. The old man at the crossroads, the queen's lingering grief, the scars on his own feet, and the testimony of the blind prophet Tiresias, who finally spoke the name of the king as both son and husband, father and brother. The revelation broke them. Jocasta, unable to bear the weight of her reality, took her own life in the palace gloom. Oedipus, stripped of his pride, snatched the golden brooches from her gown and drove the pins deep into his eyes, choosing an eternal darkness over the sight of his own ruin. He departed Thebes as a wretched wanderer, a blind beggar led only by the hand of his devoted daughter, Antigone. In the sacred groves of Colonus, the earth finally claimed him, his grave vanishing into the silence of the divine. But the curse was a hungry ghost. It did not die with him. Eteocles and Polynices, his sons, turned their fraternal love into a war for the throne. When Polynices was cast out, he raised the 7 against Thebes, a conflict that turned the city's gates into an altar of blood. The brothers met in single combat and struck each other dead, leaving the royal line to wither. Antigone, the last flame of the old honor, defied the new king Creon to bury her brother, and for her piety, she was condemned to be entombed alive. The story of Oedipus is the definitive tragedy of the human condition. It is a cautionary song of fate, a reminder that a man may run with all his might to outpace the darkness, only to collide with it in the very embrace he sought to avoid. It is a tragedy born not of malice, but of the sheer, terrifying ignorance of mortals who dare to question the gods. The house of Thebes, for all its majesty, was built upon a foundation of serpent bones and riddles, and no wisdom, no matter how brilliantly wielded, can alter the architecture of destiny. But his was not the only path home. Destiny, that capricious weaver, had entangled the fates of others in a web of iron and salt. Menelaus and Helen, the catalysts of this decade-long conflagration, found their return journey twisted by divine whim. Driven southward by relentless, contrary gales, they were cast upon the shifting sands of Egypt. Some whispers among the ancients claimed the woman who walked the battlements of Troy was but a hollow phantom, an image woven of mist and resentment, while the true Helen remained in the golden lands of Egypt, untouched by time, waiting in a gilded cage while nations bled for her shadow. Others held a more bitter truth, that she had fled willingly with Paris, and that Menelaus, hollowed out by the attrition of a 10-year siege, had eventually forgiven her, not out of love, but out of a soul-crushing weariness for peace. They returned to Sparta to rule in a silence so profound it was deafening, a kingdom that never truly recovered its sunlight. Yet, it was Odysseus whose journey transcended mere travel to become a harrowing odyssey of the spirit. His was the path most storied, the most sorrowful, and the most enduring. After the fires of Troy died to embers, he did not find his way home. Instead, he was cast into a 10-year trial of storms and monsters, caught in the suffocating vice between Poseidon's relentless, ocean-born wrath and the cold, unyielding mechanics of fate. He was no innocent, and he knew it. Odysseus had been the architect of the wooden horse, the mastermind behind the final, bloody betrayal of the city. In the carnage, he had allowed his men to desecrate temples, staining the sanctuary of Athena and invoking the fury of Poseidon. The sea god marked him as his personal prey. His ship was tossed like a dry leaf from island to island, each shore more surreal than the last. He blinded Polyphemus, the Cyclops and son of Poseidon, escaping only by the razor-thin wit of calling himself nobody. He shared a bed of forbidden intoxication with Circe, the sorceress who stripped his men of their humanity, turning them into swine, and languished for 7 long, sun-drenched years under the obsessive love of the nymph Calypso. He braved the freezing threshold of the underworld to solicit advice from the shades of the dead, and he listened to the soul-shattering song of the sirens, bound to his mast while his men rowed with wax-plugged ears to drown out the madness. He navigated the crushing jaws of Scylla and Charybdis, losing his crew to the sea and his own hubris, until at last, he washed up naked and broken on the shores of the Phaeacians. They, moved by his epic suffering, granted him the passage home. He returned to Ithaca not as a king, but as a beggar, his eyes cold and ancient, his beard matted with the brine of 1,000 leagues. The house he left behind was a carcass being picked clean. Suitors, insolent, gluttonous men, had occupied his halls, consuming his wealth and pressuring his wife, Penelope, who kept them at bay by weaving and unweaving the same funeral shroud under the flickering, lonely candlelight. With the aid of his son, Telemachus, and his steadfast swineherd, Odysseus claimed his vengeance. He strung the great bow that only he could master, and the hall of Ithaca ran red with the blood of those who had violated his hearth. Peace returned, yet it was brittle and stained. The cycle of war and the thirst for retribution were never far behind, lurking in the shadows of the throne. Others fared far worse. Ajax the Lesser, stripped of his divine protection, was struck down by Athena for his profane pride. Diomedes, perhaps the most valiant of the warriors, returned to a home that had curdled in his absence. His wife had turned unfaithful, and his city had cast him out, forcing him to wander west to found new cities that eventually faded into the mists of legend. Philoctetes, the archer who had finally slain Paris with the bow of Heracles, found his hearth cold and his neighbors suspicious, becoming a perpetual exile. Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, was slaughtered in Delphi, cut down at the altar of Apollo, an ironic penance, perhaps, for the blood he had spilled in the name of glory at Troy. The war had been promised as a golden path to immortality, yet it delivered nothing but ashes, hollow songs, and broken men. In the end, there were no true victors. There were only those who survived to carry the scars of the dead. Long before these mortals raised their shields against the wine-dark sea, there existed a deeper, more ancient current of power, the hierarchy of the gods. Their stories were the hidden architecture beneath the surface of human history. The Olympians did not merely inhabit the world. They wove the very fabric of fate. Yet they were not the first to hold the scales. Before the reign of Olympus, there was the void chaos. From that formless dark emerged Gaia and Uranus, the earth and the sky, whose violent union gave birth to the Titans. The age of the Titans was one of raw, elemental brutality, ending only when Zeus, the youngest of Cronus's children, rose in rebellion. He freed his siblings from the depths of his father's darkness and cast the old gods into the abyssal pits of Tartarus. In their place rose the 12 Olympians, though their ranks and temperaments shifted like the winds. Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, Hestia, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Ares, Aphrodite, Hephaestus, and Hermes. They established a new order, not one of greater kindness, but of infinitely greater complexity, deeply entangled in the lives of men. Zeus reigned from his golden throne, his thunderbolt a constant threat, his voice the final law of the cosmos. But his power was not mere brute strength. He was a master of diplomacy and alliances, rewarding fealty and punishing betrayal with calculated cruelty. He partitioned the world among his kin, the sky for himself, the seas for Poseidon, and the murky, shadowed underworld for Hades, while earth remained the contested, shifting playground of them all. Beside him sat Hera, his sister and his queen. Her reign was defined by the bitterness of a discarded heart, for Zeus's infidelities were as legendary as his power. He was a king who could not be satisfied, his affairs with goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women leaving a trail of suffering across the globe. Each union produced children who would eventually shatter the stability of the world. Heracles, Perseus, Helen, Minos, each a ripple in a turbulent pond. Hera, ever watchful, met these transgressions with a cold, enduring wrath, punishing the lovers and their offspring with a jealousy that spanned generations. Contrastingly, Athena emerged not from a womb, but from the intellect of Zeus himself, born fully grown and clad in armor. The goddess of wisdom and strategic war, she favored those who wielded wit over brute force. She guided the rise of cities like Athens, fostering law and reason, standing in sharp defiance to Ares, the blood-drenched god of slaughter. Her presence marked the Olympian era as one defined by the elevation of the mind. Apollo and Artemis, the twin children of Leto, balanced light and shadow. Apollo, the radiant archer, ruled over music, healing, and prophecy. From his seat at Delphi, he shaped the destiny of kings with cryptic, bone-chilling riddles. Yet, he was also the bringer of plague, as the Achaeans discovered to their horror at Troy. Artemis, his sister, claimed the wild places, an untouched huntress who demanded reverence and tolerated no trespass in her sacred, darkened groves. Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, bound the world to the cycle of the seasons. When her daughter, Persephone, was stolen by Hades, her grief withered the earth, birthing the frost of winter and the longing of spring. Then there was Aphrodite, born of the sea foam where the severed flesh of Uranus touched the brine, a goddess whose beauty drove gods and mortals alike into a frenzy of madness. Bound in a loveless marriage to Hephaestus, the lame smith of the gods, she cast her gaze toward Ares, the god of war. Together, they represented the volatile dance of passion and conflict. Hermes, the quicksilver messenger, moved through these realms as a thief, a trickster, and a guide for the souls of the dead. He was the god of boundaries, the one who could walk from the peak of Olympus to the depths of Hades without ever being detained. No door was locked to him, and he navigated the politics of the gods with a permanent, knowing smile. These Olympians were not distant, uncaring creators. They were immanent, meddling, and deeply petty. They were not mere forces of nature like the Titans. They were mirrors of human nature blown up to divine proportions. Their pride was vast, their grudges eternal, and their loves were cataclysmic. They demanded sacrifices, founded cities, and whispered through oracles, all while Hestia, the quiet goddess of the hearth, kept a small, flickering flame alive in every home, asking for little, offering peace in return. Yet, beneath their grandeur lay the uncomfortable truth of their own fragility. They could be bound by oaths, outmaneuvered by mortals, and ultimately undone by the relentless passage of time. Even Zeus, the king of the gods, lived in the shadow of the same fear that had consumed his father, the terror that one day, a child of his own would rise to overthrow him. It was this fear that led him to force the marriage of the sea-nymph Thetis to the mortal Peleus, ensuring their son, Achilles, would remain mortal and never ascend to rival the gods. In this, the Olympians were no different from the men who prayed to them. They feared the encroaching dark, they clung to their marble thrones, and they fought with desperate ferocity to keep their order intact. But for a golden age, they held sway, their names etched into every temple, their deeds echoing in every song. The age of heroes had begun to wane, yet the gods remained masters of the world of men. And yet, from the distant horizons, a new, unsettling wind began to blow. New gods were stirring in the darkness, rumors of powers that did not dwell in marble halls but in the wild, tangled depths of the earth. Olympus remained, for the moment, the center of the world, but even the gods could feel the world beginning to tilt. And in that shifting of the tides, everything that once stood firm was destined to splinter. Prophecy was never a gift of omnipotence. It was the cruel burden of awareness. And to realize the truth too late, once the trap had already sprung, was often indistinguishable from the very tragedy one had hoped to avoid. Yet humanity hungered for the foresight of the gods. They beat paths into the jagged slopes of Delphi, offering gold and the warm, metallic scent of goat blood, pleading for clarity with trembling lips. They understood, in their marrow, that while fate remained an immutable cage, there was a stark, desperate dignity in facing it head-on. To see the tempest brewing on the horizon was not a means to stop the rain. It was a way to ensure that, when the lightning finally struck, one met it with eyes wide open. In this agonizing friction between the hunger for knowledge and the reality of helplessness, the Greeks forged their philosophy of life. Their legends were not odes to triumphing over destiny, but hymns to the grace maintained in the face of inevitable defeat. Hector, knowing the walls of Troy would crumble and his life would be snuffed out, still cinched his bronze breastplate tight. Achilles, fully aware that his path led only to a glorious, early grave, still steered his black-prowed ships toward the Trojan coast. Oedipus, in his frantic crusade to outrun the shadow of his doom, merely sprinted headlong into its heart. Meanwhile, the Pythia, the oracle, remained, year after year, a hollow vessel for the divine, exhaling cryptic riddles through the intoxicating haze of laurel smoke. Her voice was the frigid respiration of a universe that had long ago crystallized the future. To the ancient Greek, death was not a final punctuation mark, but a mere shifting of breath. What lay beyond was not a moral binary of heaven or hell, but a realm as vast, neutral, and primordial as the deep ocean. It was a subterranean expanse where every shade, king and pauper, saint and sinner, undertook their final pilgrimage. This was Hades, the dark mirror of the sunlit world. Though it lacked the infernal pyres and horned tormentors of later mythologies, it held a dread so profound that men hesitated to utter the god's name. They preferred the euphemism Pluton, the wealthy one. It was a chilling logic. All veins of silver, all veins of gold, and all the souls of the departed originated from the crushing depths beneath the earth. The geography of the underworld was not charted by the surveyors of men, but by the jagged cartography of memory and grief. At its threshold flowed the 5 rivers, each a jagged seam in the fabric of existence. Styx, the river of unbreakable oaths; Acheron, the roiling torrent of sorrow; Phlegethon, the river of liquid flame; Cocytus, the chilling current of lamentation; and Lethe, whose waters offered the agonizing mercy of oblivion. The dead arrived as phantoms, Psyche breathless and translucent. Stripped of their mortal clay, they were ferried across the Acheron by Charon, a dour boatman who accepted only the toll of a single coin placed beneath the tongue. Those denied a proper burial or lacking the means to pay were condemned to hover upon the desolate shores for a century, weeping into the mist. Upon landing, they were greeted by Cerberus, the triple-throated sentinel, whose snarls ensured that the boundaries between the living and the dead remained inviolate. Beyond him stretched the asphodel meadows, a gray, sunless expanse where the majority of souls drifted like autumn leaves, their identities eroded by the relentless tides of eternity. But justice, however cold, existed. The judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, weighed the soul's essence. The depraved were hurled into the abyss of Tartarus, a prison of such depth it made the stars seem like mere pebbles. There, they suffered agonies tailored to their hubris. Sisyphus straining against his stone, Tantalus eternally grasping for water that receded from his lips, Ixion trapped upon his spinning wheel of fire. The virtuous, however, found their way to the Elysian fields, a verdant paradise bathed in perpetual spring and soft winds, where heroes could retain their memories and walk in the honored company of their kin. The gods themselves were subject to this same inexorable rhythm. Even they were not truly immortal in the eyes of history. Their power relied on memory, their relevance on the shifting winds of human reverence. Every mythic cycle inevitably reaches a point of quietude. When the vivid, chaotic figures of the past fade from the dreamscapes of the living, and the marble thrones, once etched by lightning, are worn smooth by the erosion of centuries, the age of the gods draws to a close. For the Olympians, this slow sunset began not with the clashing of swords, but with the rise of Rome. The Romans did not seek to obliterate the Greek pantheon. They performed a grand, calculated act of translation. Zeus was cloaked in the civic gravity of Jupiter. Hera became the regal Juno. Poseidon was cast as the formidable Neptune. It was an evolution of empire. The wild, unpredictable spirits of Greece were tempered and shackled to the Roman ideals of hierarchy, law, and absolute order. Yet, as the Roman eagle spread its wings, the old gods grew distant, becoming symbolic shadows rather than living forces. New faiths emerged from the corners of the world: Mithraism from the east, the cult of Isis from the sands of Egypt, and finally the singular, jealous light of Christianity. This new creed did not just compete, it dismantled the foundation of the old world. The Olympians did not vanish in a blaze of glory or a final apocalyptic war. They simply lost their audience. As the temples were shuttered and the sacrificial fires cooled, the gods retreated into the pages of history and the galleries of art. But they never truly departed. They exist still, woven into the architecture of the Western consciousness. They live in the metaphors of our literature, the psychology of our dreams, and the archetypes that define our tragedies. We still look to them when we speak, and in that great turning, it was ordained that all things must eventually break. To possess the gift of prophecy was never a true power. It was a burden of relentless awareness. And that awareness, arriving almost always too late, was indistinguishable from the sharp sting of tragedy. Yet humanity hungered for prophecy. They trekked the jagged mountain paths to Delphi, laden with offerings of gold and the scent of goat's blood, their voices trembling as they cast questions into the void. This was the domain of Hades, named for the sovereign who presided over its stillness. Though his kingdom lacked the sulphurous flames and jagged pitchforks of later lore, it inspired a dread so profound that the living dared not speak his name aloud. They called him Pluton, the wealthy one, for all the riches of the world, every vein of silver and pulse of gold, drew their origin from beneath the earth, just as every life eventually returned to the soil. The geography of the underworld was not charted by the laws of physics, but by the cartography of myth and memory. At its threshold flowed the 5 rivers, each a physical and spiritual boundary. There was the Styx, the dark water of hatred and inviolable oaths. Acheron, the river of sorrow where tears gathered into a tide. Phlegethon, a surging torrent of fire. Cocytus, the stream of endless lamentation. And finally, Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, whose waters scrubbed the past from the mind. The dead arrived as flickers of shadow. Psyche *, breathless and bloodless, stripped of their mortal form and voice. They crossed the dark threshold with the assistance of Charon, the ferryman. For the price of a single coin, he would row them across the Acheron. Those denied proper burial, or those unable to pay the fare, were doomed to wander the banks for a century, weeping in the mist, forever denied the peace of rest. Upon entry, the souls were confronted by Cerberus, the 3-headed hound whose snarling vigilance ensured that the dead remained in and the living stayed out. Beyond the guardian stretched the asphodel meadows, a dim, gray expanse where the vast majority of souls drifted in a haze of forgetting, their presence no more substantial than the rustle of dry autumn leaves. Yet not all fates were identical. The underworld was governed by the tripartite judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, who weighed the merit of every life. The truly malevolent were cast into the depths of Tartarus, a chasm of torment plunging further than the foundations of the world. Here, oath-breakers and betrayers endured punishments crafted to mirror the sins of their lives. Sisyphus, the eternal laborer, pushed his boulder toward a summit he would never reach. Tantalus, forever parched, reached for water that receded at his touch, and Ixion, bound to his fiery, spinning wheel, tasted the centrifugal agony of his own hubris. The rare few deemed virtuous earned passage to the Elysian fields, a paradise of temperate breezes, emerald meadows, and perpetual golden spring. In that sanctuary, heroes might linger in comfort, their memories preserved and their earthly deeds honored. Fewer still might choose the cycle of reincarnation, drinking from the river Lethe to purge their previous existence and begin the grand, cyclical journey anew. In later mystery traditions, an enlightened soul might dream of breaking the wheel entirely to ascend among the stars, though such a fate remained a shadowed, uncertain hope. At the epicenter of this silent empire sat Hades, stern and immobile, a monarch devoid of vanity. He did not crave worship, nor did he entangle himself in the petty affairs of mortals. He reigned with an absolute, detached sovereignty. His domain was unchanging, and he preferred it that way. He was not the malevolent villain of later myths, but an immovable constant, the shadow cast by the brilliant storm of Zeus and the shifting tides of Poseidon. Beside him stood Persephone, queen of the underworld, whose narrative reveals the peculiar duality of death within the Greek psyche. She was the daughter of Demeter, the goddess of the harvest. One spring afternoon, as she gathered lilies, the earth fractured, and Hades surged forth in his chariot to bear her away into the lightless deep. Demeter's grief was cataclysmic. She allowed the world to wither. Crops failed, rivers turned to dust, and a suffocating famine gripped the earth. She would not permit the soil to bloom until her daughter was returned. At last, Zeus dispatched Hermes to broker a return, but because Persephone had consumed the seeds of a pomegranate, she was inextricably bound to the underworld. The resulting compromise became the heartbeat of the seasons. Persephone would dwell with Hades for a portion of the year, during which Demeter wept and the world turned to ice. When she returned, the earth burst into blossom. Death and life were thus reconciled into a cycle, not a final sentence. Over time, Persephone's stature shifted from captive to sovereign, a queen of mysteries who moved through the shadows with a quiet, terrifying authority. During the Eleusinian mysteries, those sacred, hidden rites performed outside Athens, the story of her descent and return was reenacted, offering the initiates not just the promise of the harvest, but a glimpse into the renewal of the soul itself. The underworld was not a hermetically sealed vault. A handful of mortals journeyed to its depths and survived to recount the tale. Orpheus sang a melody so sorrowful that he charmed the iron heart of Hades, only to lose Eurydice to the tragedy of a backward glance. Heracles descended to drag Cerberus into the light, and Odysseus, guided by Circe's counsel, poured libations to summon the ghosts of Tiresias, Achilles, and Agamemnon. Each returned with a hollow warning. Death was not a glorious transition, but a final, diminishing end. Better to be a beggar in the sun than a king among the shades. The ghost of Achilles, once the greatest of the Greeks, had whispered. Thus, the Greeks treated their tombs with sacred care. They buried their dead with coins for Charon, weapons for the hunt, wine for the thirst, and songs for the journey. They poured libations at the family hearth, for the dead were never truly gone. They haunted the periphery of dreams, sent omens, and through the right rituals and blood, could even be summoned to provide answers that were, perhaps, better left unspoken. The underworld functioned as a mirror of life, a reflection of memory, justice, and the finality of existence. It offered no Christian-coded heaven or hell, simply an eternal, dark expanse ruled by a god who sought neither love nor devotion, only the perfect, undisturbed silence of the grave. In that stillness, the Greeks found the true architecture of eternity. And in their stories of kings and queens beneath the earth, of judgment and rivers, of loss and return, they gave death a dignified place within the cosmos. It was not a punishment to be feared, but a passage to be understood. Even the gods, however, are not immortal. Not in memory, not in power, and certainly not in the reverence of the masses. There arrives a moment in every mythic cycle where the divine begins to grow quiet. When once vivid figures fade into the dim edges of men's dreams, and thrones forged in the fires of thunder are eventually worn smooth by the relentless friction of time. For the gods of Olympus, that slow retreat did not begin with a cataclysmic war or a prophecy of doom, but with the rise of Rome, a world that had grown restless under the weight of archaic tales. The Romans did not eradicate the Greek gods. They assimilated them. They adopted the pantheon, bestowed upon them Latin names, and folded their myths into the framework of Roman values and imperial conquest. Zeus became Jupiter, Hera, Juno, Poseidon, Neptune. It was a transformation as calculated as it was reverent. Rome admired the grandeur of Olympus, but it refashioned these deities to reflect its own obsession with order, hierarchy, and the majesty of the state. Jupiter no longer thundered from a wild, untamed peak, but from the Capitoline hill, draped in the formal robes of a lawgiver. The erratic, wild Dionysus became the structured Bacchus, and Athena's fierce, independent spirit was tempered into the civic, administrative wisdom of Minerva. In the realm of letters, the myths persisted yet transformed. Ovid, in his Metamorphoses, retold the ancient tales in golden, fluid Latin, seasoning them with irony and poetic grace. Virgil, in the Aeneid, transformed the gods into mere instruments of fate, tugging at the strings behind Rome's rise to prominence. But something vital had been lost since Homer. The gods of the Iliad had stalked the battlefield, naked in their passions, visible in the dust and the gore. In Roman myth, they had become symbolic, distant, and politicized themes rather than presences. As the empire expanded, it collided with a constellation of new deities. From the east arrived Mithras, born from stone, a slayer of cosmic bulls. From Egypt came Isis, the mother of magic and life, draped in silk and inscrutable secrets. From Judea emerged a singular, invisible god, one who forbade images, scorned idols, and left no room for divine siblings or thunder-wielding tyrants. These emerging cults did not merely compete with the Olympians. They dismantled the very architecture of Greek belief. Where the old gods ruled by raw appetite and ancestral hierarchy, these new faiths offered moral clarity, unity, and the promise of personal salvation. Simultaneously, philosophy began to erode the mythic world from within. Thinkers like Xenophanes had long ridiculed the anthropomorphic nature of the gods, wryly noting that if oxen had deities, they would undoubtedly resemble bulls. Plato, though he admired the aesthetic beauty of myth, cast doubt on its literal truth, arguing that the gods must be paragons of perfection rather than the jealous, lustful figures who bickered in the halls of Olympus. Epicurus declared that if the gods existed, they were utterly indifferent to human affairs, making the fear of divine retribution a mere superstition to be discarded. Even Stoicism, with its stern ethical rigor, relocated divinity from figures to reason itself, the logos that govern the universe. By the time the imperial cult emerged, when emperors were declared divine and altars were erected to mortal men, the line between myth and statecraft had frayed completely. The old gods were reduced to symbols. Their temples remained open more for the sake of tradition than for the sanctity of belief. Farmers still offered grain to Demeter and sailors prayed to Poseidon, but the conviction that these gods walked among them had withered. The flame on Olympus had not yet extinguished, but it flickered low in the draft of a changing world. And then came the final, decisive blow, not from a rival cult, but from a revolution of faith. Christianity, once a persecuted fringe sect, surged across the empire, carried not by the edge of the sword, but by the weight of the word. This God was invisible, singular, and omnipotent. Its narrative was not one of lovers and divine vengeance, but of sin, sacrifice, and salvation. In time, its churches replaced the ancient shrines. Its hymns drowned out the notes of the lyre. Its priests denounced the Olympians as demons or hollow fictions. Under the reign of Theodosius I, pagan temples were shuttered by law, the Olympic Games were abolished, and the rites of sacrifice were outlawed. The gods did not stage a last stand. There was no final war between Zeus and Christ, no divine siege of Rome. The Olympians simply receded like the last light of a long golden day. Their statues grew weathered and silent. Their altars went cold. Marble columns fractured, and ivy crept slowly into the spaces where priests had once stood in awe. The myths remained, but they were relegated to the realm of literature, not living faith. Children studied Heracles in schoolbooks, not at the foot of altars. Artists depicted Athena, but they did not offer prayers for her favor. The gods who had once commanded the storms and the fates were now mere stories, haunting, beautiful, and strange. Yet they endured. Even as their temples crumbled into dust, they survived in whispers, in verses, and in the very marrow of the Western imagination. They returned in the brushstrokes of the Renaissance, in the inquiries of the Enlightenment, in the sweeping epics of the Romantics, and in the retellings of the modern era. They became archetypes of war and wisdom, of love and betrayal, of hubris and glory. The Greeks had gifted them human faces, and in doing so had granted them a different kind of immortality. Though the temples fell and the oracles were silenced, the myths of Olympus did not expire. They became echoes, faint at first, like the distant, mournful strumming of a lyre on the wind, growing louder as time passed and the world began once again to listen. Because myth, unlike the fragile borders of kingdoms, is not bound by stone or sword. It dwells in the unmapped realm of human imagination, and there, the gods have always found a way to return. During the long centuries of Christian hegemony in Europe, the gods were not worshipped, but they were never truly forgotten. Monks and scholars painstakingly copied ancient texts, sometimes begrudgingly preserving the works of Homer, Hesiod, Euripides, and Sophocles, even as they condemned the beliefs those works once sustained. The old stories persisted in the quietude of libraries, tucked between sermons and treatises, waiting. Then came the Renaissance, that great rotation of the wheel when Europe looked backward to find the momentum to move forward. In the courts of Florence, the chapels of Rome, and the minds of thinkers like Petrarch and Erasmus, the gods rose again, not as deities to be feared, but as symbols of the human condition. Painters draped Aphrodite in seashells and shifting light. Sculptors returned to Apollo, capturing his bow and his grace in white marble. Poets invoked the muses once more. Myth was reborn on canvas and in stone, rather than in smoke and incense. The gods no longer dictated the movements of the sky, but they reigned supreme in the galleries of art. In the Age of Enlightenment, reason challenged superstition, yet the myths remained, studied, dissected, and translated. To Voltaire, they were elegant allegories. To Goethe, they were mirrors of the soul. Romanticism followed, bringing a return to the emotional, the tragic, and the sublime. Writers looked to Oedipus and Antigone, to Orpheus and Eurydice, and found in them the eternal, unanswerable questions. What is fate? What is love? What does it truly mean to be human? Then came the modern age, and myth was no longer the exclusive province of the classical scholar. It permeated literature, cinema, psychology, and even the colorful pages of comics. Carl Jung recognized the gods as archetypes residing within the human psyche, eternally re-emerging in every generation. James Joyce wove them into the grit of Dublin's streets. Rick Riordan reimagined them for the classrooms of Manhattan. In the pantheons of Marvel and DC, the gods walked again, not in sandals and robes but in armor and spandex. And always, in the background, the old tales remained unchangeable. Odysseus still battled the tides. Heracles still performed his labors. Persephone still rose each spring to reclaim the sun. They were not forgotten. They were simply translated, generation to generation, into new tongues, new forms, and new dreams. Because myth is never fixed. It is a living memory, sculpted by the hands of those who carry it. What the Greeks gave us was not merely a list of deities, but a framework, a way to map the world, to wrestle with the finality of death, to honor the fragile beauty of life, and to understand the self. Their gods were flawed, yes, but gloriously so. In them, we saw not perfection, but potential. The agony of choice, the thrill of risk, the devastating weight of hubris, and the grounding comfort of ritual. They told us what we might aspire to become and what we must inevitably fear. Even now, in a world dominated by the cold light of science and the deafening noise of the digital age, the myths continue to murmur. You hear them in the stories of the chosen hero, in the sudden flare of a falling star, in the slow, rhythmic turning of the seasons. A girl descends into the dark and the spring waits in expectation. A king defies his prophecy and loses the world. A mother mourns the son. The faces change, but the truths remain constant. The gods may have abandoned Olympus, but they never truly left us. They walk quietly now in our books, our songs, our dreams, and our memories. In every tale that dares to reach beyond the mortal veil. They are not dead. They have merely relocated. And as the story reaches its quiet conclusion, the winds on Mount Olympus blow cold, and the torches at Delphi have long since turned to ash. But the myths remain. Good night.